If you've ever walked through the business section of a bookstore, you've definitely seen it. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. It's got to be one of the most influential and, yeah, controversial personal finance books ever written. So in this explainer, we're going to do a deep dive, break down the core ideas, look at its huge impact, and get into the controversies that still follow it around today. And listen, when I say influential, I'm not kidding. Since it first came out back in 1997, this book has sold over 32 million copies all over the world. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 6 years. That is just a wild amount of reach for a book that basically tells you everything you've been taught about money is wrong. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get into the core philosophy, this whole tale of two dads. Then we'll hit the big ideas, assets versus liabilities, and the cash flow quadrant. From there, we'll pivot into the controversy surrounding the book, and we'll wrap it all up with the final verdict. Is this book a mindset guide or an actual instruction manual?
All right, so the entire book is really built around this one simple but super powerful story. Kiyosaki says he had two dads growing up. His actual father, who he calls Poor Dad, a really smart, highly educated guy who always struggled with money, and his best friend's dad, the Rich Dad, who was a high school dropout but ended up a millionaire.
And this right here, this comparison, is the absolute heart of the book's philosophy. It starts with the same advice, right? Study hard. But the goal is completely different. Poor Dad's advice is all about becoming a secure part of the system. Rich Dad's advice? It's about owning the system. That one little change in perspective is what drives every single lesson in the book.
And this all boils down to Rich Dad's #1 rule. Most of us get stuck in a trap, just trading our time for a paycheck. He argues the real path to wealth isn't about getting a bigger salary. It's about building systems where your money is out there making more money for you, even when you're not working.
So that big idea leads us to what Kiyosaki says is the single most important rule of financial literacy. He's basically like, look, if you only learn one thing from me, let it be the difference between an asset and a liability.
And his definition could not be simpler. Seriously, forget all the complicated accounting jargon. An asset puts money in your pocket. That's it. Think about a rental property that brings in cash every month, or a stock that pays you a dividend. If cash is flowing towards you, congratulations, it's an asset. And, you guessed it, the other side of the coin is just as straightforward. A liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket. You've got the obvious stuff, car payments, credit card debt, but also things we don't always think of that way, like home maintenance or insurance. If money is flowing away from you, it's a liability.
And this simple rule leads him to his most famous and, yeah, his most controversial claim. Your house, it's not an asset. So why would he say that? Well, because you're constantly paying out money for it. The mortgage, property taxes, insurance, repairs, it's just a constant drain on your cash. In his world, your home is probably the biggest liability you'll ever own.
Okay, so building on that, Kiyosaki gives us another framework to think about our financial lives. He calls it the cash flow quadrant. It's a way to categorize everybody into one of 4 groups based purely on where their income is coming from.
So think of it like this. There's a left side and a right side. On the left, you've got E for employee, people who want security, and S for self-employed, people who are perfectionists and are their own system. On the right, you've got B for business owner, someone who owns a system that other people work in, and I for investor, where your money is doing the work for you. The whole point is that real financial freedom happens when you move from the left side of this quadrant to the right side.
The ideas are simple, they're memorable, and they've clearly lit a fire under millions of people. But, and this is where we really have to shift gears, we have to ask the big question: how much of this is actually real?
And that question opens up a huge can of worms, bringing us to the book's very controversial legacy. Because for all of its fame, Rich Dad, Poor Dad has been dogged by criticism, questioning pretty much everything from the story itself to the advice it gives.
Okay, so this is the big one, the bombshell, really. The central character, the rich dad, who gives all this incredible wisdom, might not have even existed. Kiyosaki himself has reportedly said that the character is just a composite, or even a myth, kind of like Harry Potter, just to make a point. And for critics, that's a huge problem. I mean, if the main character isn't real, how can you trust the lessons he teaches?
And the critiques don't stop there. A lot of experts say the financial advice itself is shaky. They'll point out that his stories, finding a house for 72% off are these once-in-a-lifetime deals, not a real strategy you can just go out and copy. Others say the books are super repetitive and don't give you any practical how-to steps. And maybe the biggest one today is that his obsession with real estate is just dangerously outdated advice for our current economy.
So where does that leave us? You have this mega bestseller on one hand, and all these serious, valid criticisms on the other. How do we make sense of it all? Let's try to land on a balanced conclusion here, weighing what the book is against what it's not.
Okay, let's just lay it all out. On the plus side, the book is amazing at shifting your mindset. It got millions of people talking about financial literacy, and it gave us a super simple language, assets versus liabilities, to think about money. But on the flip side, you have the fact that the premise is probably fiction, there's no real step-by-step guide, and a lot of the advice doesn't really hold up today. The general feeling is that it's a fantastic motivator, but a really bad instruction manual.
So here's the bottom line. This is probably the best way to approach Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Read it to challenge your deep-seated beliefs about work and wealth. Use it to change the why behind your financial goals. But when it's time to figure out the how, the actual nuts and bolts of investing your money, you should definitely go find more practical, more current, and more verifiable advice.
Which leaves us with one final and pretty big question to chew on. The book's whole argument is that we don't learn about money in school, and we've just seen that some of the biggest bestsellers might be more inspiration than education. So it really makes you wonder, where does real, practical financial education actually come from? That's something to think about.